Hello and welcome to the South Asia Research Institute for Minorities podcast. I am Zehra Naqvi, your host for today, a senior research associate at South Asia Research Institute for Minorities and a woman and minority right advocate. At South Asia Research Institute for Minorities, we work to amplify marginalized voice, promote research, and create platform for advocacy on the issues affecting marginalized communities across South Asia. Today's session is especially significant as we mark the International Day of Nonviolence today. So, our theme is Nonviolence and Justice, promoting minority women through right based legal frameworks. To explore this important subject, we are joined by our guest speaker, Murdula Vinangamodi, a legal based right lawyer advocate from India. Mradula has been at the forefront of advocating for justice, particularly for marginalized communities across South Asia, and we are honored to have her with us today. Thank you so much for joining. Mradula, how are you?
I'm good, Zara. I hope you are well as well. It's been a while since I've interacted.
Yes, thank you. So, begin with, could you please share a bit about your journey as a right-based lawyer and advocate, and what inspired you to work on caste, criminal laws, women, and human rights areas?
So, well, I think what the reason I took up law in the first place was because I felt helpless in a lot of situations when I was younger. And I thought that knowing the law could be a tool that helped me feel a little more empowered. So it started at a very personal journey, I guess. And I always had an interest towards human rights. I think there was like always an innate sense of preserving a human essence. Like there's something like I also grew up at a time where, like, technology was like at the forefront in a city where, I felt like dehumanization happens at various levels. And you need to first understand what that human essence is to in order to preserve it. So that was a journey that also sort of happened parallelly along with my pursuit of law or legal education. Of course, when I entered law school, it was not as I expected. So I went to law school hoping to learn about these things that empowered me, but in fact I found that experience to be very disempowering. So then when I looked at law, it was a tool that served the powerful. It's the tool, and even we were being trained in order to serve interests of the powerful rather than my initial volition that drove me to pursue law. That was just nowhere to be found. And it also had like the law school experience also was very disconnected from my existence or the existence of people who are like me. So what I at the very initial days of my law school, what I discovered was that it wasn't a place for people like me. It was just not designed with even the imagination of a person like me, that I would at some time, or people like me would come up here and want to learn and want to serve different interests, not particularly corporate and like upper class elite interests, right? Which I couldn't really connect with, because I didn't have anybody around me that was like that. So what was the point of my education was, but then it was also, I also lived for most part of my law school experience, I also lived in like a lot of mystification about what I was looking for, like, because it wasn't easily like, even the way human rights was as a law as was like conceptualized at law school, it felt very abstract and distant from my lived experience, or from the lived experience around me that I knew of. So then I started looking out for. I actually should say that even though I went to law school, I kind of had to self educate myself on a lot of these things. Right. So of course I found a lot of resources outside of what was designed for me in the curriculum, and I found my path somehow. And that way I started realizing, okay, there is an entire way you can use law to benefit people who otherwise find themselves find themselves at a loss when violence happens to them. So there's an entire group of people, all kinds of marginalized people who are like just helpless in the face of violence. The only way they know how to respond to violence is by internalizing it, and or like passing it on to people who are lesser, who have less power than themselves. So there's a hierarchy of violence and power flowing, right? So law, on the other hand, questions that power itself. It gives you the ability to question. So if there is violence that is arising from an abuse of power, you get to challenge it. So that is something a lot of people don't understand, that is a possibility. Of course, it's not an easy it's not an easy mechanism given the access to justice difficulties that that's prevalent in this day and age. I think world over, like legal access to justice is not easy, or it's a very expensive matter. It's easier to go and like uh maybe be violent back at the person who is, or the group of interests that are oppressing you. It's easier to pick up violence, but that's not going to solve the problem of abuse of power. You will just end up changing the people who are doing that. So if you are violently overthrowing your overlord, you become the overlord. That's an inevitability, but you're not finding a solution to that pattern of relationship itself. There is no point in changing roles. It's about changing that entire dynamic of relationship. That's where the lack of a better term, I would say magic is, because it's the easiest to overthrow your overlord or the person who is your oppressor through violence, whether it's verbal, whether it's physical, whether it's economical. It's always, but the magic and the miracle of that changing that relationship is through non-violent means, and the legal tool is one such means, in my opinion. So this is where I've come at after my years of learning the law, as a student and as a younger practitioner, and now as a more, just relatively more experienced practitioner than I was before. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing that. It's inspiring to hear how your journey begins. So, the next question is about how do you see the principle of non-violence connecting the legal struggle for protecting marginalized women or communities in today's South Asia?
So I have to answer this question, I have to highlight the influence of two historical figures on my life. One is the Buddha, and the other is Dr. B.R. Ambedkar. I think Dr. B.R. Ambedkar himself also drawing from the Buddha. Uh, Non-violence is, I mean, if you see the entire constitutional architecture, it's designed to be a non-violent architecture of power distribution between the state, within the state, and between the state and the citizen, or like the the yeah, and the citizen. So that relationship is defined, and the power of the state itself is limited, so that the state's power cannot overwhelm the individual or the powerless citizens, or any persons for that matter. It cannot overpower human life. So that is the way Dr. Ambedkar has envisioned the future democratic republic of India, and tried to bring in as many supporting principles as possible. So non-violence, I think, see, non-violence is a way of life. It's a way of natural life, I think. And I think that violence is like a creation of human nature. If you look at like violence, in the sense that violence that's derived from ill will, the intention and desire to harm another person so that you can survive, that instinct is very, that instinct at a larger scale, that unrelentless the relentless instinct to harm, to exist at the cost of others, or to prevail at the cost of others, is very man-made. It's very human-made, rather. Nature is just nature. It's just, even if there is violence, it's not stemming out of ill will and hatred. It's just survival. There is no ill intention when a lion kills a deer. It's just hungry. But when human beings do that to other people, even when they are full, they want more. The extractive nature, that's very distinctly human, right? So I'd like to distinguish here between the natural law and the positive law, and talk about how religion itself, right, it tries to establish a sense of natural law, right? And then you have the positive law, which, if it doesn't align with the natural law, that killing another human being is wrong, like it's just basic moral principle, and then the law supports it. But if there is a law that says that killing a person in so and so circumstance is wrong, then I think that the law can be questioned, right? So I see non-violence as a principle that is difficult for human beings to maybe practice. So you have the law, an enforceable sanction by the state, to come in and ensure that non-violence is prevalent. Without the law, for example, there are many ideologies that say that you can violently overthrow your oppressor, but the Baba Sahib has always been against that. He's like, there's no point. His main insistence on the revolution of the mind, that the oppressor's mind has to be changed in order to remove that condition of oppression, rather than just killing them in blood, because if you kill one, thousands more will sprout. So that was never like a that's where Dr. Ambedkar also distinguishes himself, and the Ambedkarite ideology distinguishes itself from the Marxist ideology, or the communist ideology, because the communists believe it's okay, you can overthrow your there is like you overthrow your oppressors, class oppressors, through whatever means. And that's something that Dr. B.R. Ambedkar disagrees with, because he says that there's no point to that, and he derives that from uh, Buddha himself. Yeah.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. Thank you for your thought-provoking perspective. As we know that your expertise in caste and criminal laws, so what are the some key challenges that marginalized groups, especially women, encounter when they seek justice through the legal system?
Marginalized women in particular, f- as far as they have many multifaceted problems vis-a-vis the legal system. So as women, in like, firstly as women, and then like let's put the marginalized status later, but firstly as women, in conflict with the established patriarchal norms, it's very difficult for them to for us women to sort of stand up on our own. But there are certain axes of privileges. In India, it might be class and caste, for example, that can help make that a little more easier and comfortable. But what I've noticed is marginalized women have an additional burden. First of all, there are many differences between an upper caste woman and a marginalized woman, which I want to point out here. Firstly, an upper caste woman's life is better documented, in the sense her existence is better documented. They usually are more educated. They usually have access to people and networks that will support them through maybe filing a complaint. So their voices have some relative advantage in when they're going to file a complaint or whatever, because they're also related to men who might be privileged and have access to these institutions, and in certain cases they find help. But the difference between women without these privileges in India is that their lives themselves are very undocumented. So when say for example, your marriage is not documented, or your children don't have the necessary certificates, you are likely to find yourself at a greater disadvantage in going and proving that your case matters. So your voice has that much less credibility because it's not backed up by papers. So there's that one issue. The second issue is the way police see your issues versus a woman with a relative privilege. So a lot of marginalized women are believed to deserve, like there's a perception that they are probably deserving the violence. If, for example, sexual harassment or assault faced by marginalized women can be taken less seriously because there's also that pure the religious aspect to it, na. So if you are born of a high, if you're like a quote unquote high born woman and you have suffered sexual violence, it's seen with more seriousness because there are men, especially when the man who's committed these crimes against you belongs to a different caste, that would be seen with more seriousness than, say, for example, a Dalit or a Muslim woman who faces the same kind of sexual crime from a privileged caste man or any other man. It's taken less seriously. There are more obstacles to believing their cases, and there's also more suspicion of their character than it would be for a woman from a different community. There's also an assumption that such women are morally loose or not protected enough by their communities, or their community is like that. So there are all of these challenges that are additionally faced by marginalized women, at least in the South Asian context.
Yeah, thank you so much for shedding light on those challenges. It is important for our listener to understand the barriers that marginalized women encounters. So, from your experiences, how can a legal framework and strengthen to better safeguard the right of oppressed groups or women across the South Asia?
That's a good question. So, when we talk about the principle of equal protection of the law and equality before the law, we have to we can't look at it very rigidly. So when you say equal protection of a law, equal protection of law can in principle only be realized when the circumstances of each distinctions are, paid due attention to. Right. See, I'll give you an example. At least in the Indian context, you have the regular IPC and you have the SC/ST Atrocities Act. So when there are crimes committed against scheduled caste women or scheduled tribe women, I think that even it's taken with, there is an additional layer of protection because their caste also makes them vulnerable. So you have a sense of, or some semblance of intersectionality there, right? But if both these kinds of women are, that is scheduled caste, scheduled tribe women, and general category woman, their cases were seen similarly, or like if they were given the same, not, I won't say equal, but the same kind of protection, it may be unequal. So equality is also not same, right? So the law should be designed in ways that acknowledge these circumstantial differences and make room for that. So you cannot have blanket laws or that don't take these specific social realities into consideration. So that's important for the laws to apply or protect to different kinds of women, or to different women coming from different backgrounds. So that's the law's duty, I feel. Yeah.
And thank
For
you for your
example, I'll
very,
give you an
yeah.
example here, another example. When you think about complaint, something like writing a complaint, a well-educated woman can perhaps write a complaint better than a woman who is probably just semi-literate, right? Now, how can like the system help the semi-literate woman write her complaint effectively? Are there any, unless you give that woman that kind of resource, The state in some way helps the woman access the necessary resources for her whole complaint to be documented with the police station, it wouldn't be equal access or equal protection of the law. So that's one example.
Yeah, thank you for providing a clear path that how legal system can be more inclusive and protective. So looking ahead, what role do you think young lawyer, activists, or communities can play in advancing justice and non-violence for the marginalized communities?
So advocacy, so lawyers, of course, they can do many things, like subsidized legal aid and legal services at a subsidized price. I mean, cost, and also just being more patient with women lawyers. I think women who are coming from these, like, you can't expect women to give you everything in a certain way. Just a little bit more patience with them, and there's a lot of things that NGOs and civil society groups can do. One is they could perhaps assist women. At least here in our country, we see a lot of civil society groups being very, very active in assisting women with the crisis management and documenting. Like, I mentioned how these women do not have the resources to document their lives as effectively as others. So they'll help them with that documentation bit, right? And they'll help them with, for example, the complaint writing. Ideally, it would be great if the state can provide some access, but you also have NGOs filling in that gap by coming in the gap where the state doesn't or can't support these women without ability to maybe translate the complaint into writing. That's where they help them dealing with the police. Then teaching women to write complaints, like teaching women their rights itself is a big advocacy work that needs to be done, because a lot of women, even very educated ones, aren't aware of their rights, aren't aware of how to use a law and legal advice to take decisions. You see a lot of, like, again, I go back to how I learned about the law, and, like, how I saw the privileged people or powerful interests use the law. Every action of theirs is informed with legal advice, and they take informed actions, so they have better consequences, and they are able to foresee legal consequences much ahead of others. And it also helps when advocacy groups can give this foresight of helping them use lawyers and, like, advance their interests through the law and through non-violence. So, and for example, a lot of times non-violence is also justified in, like, especially we see this in domestic violence cases a lot, right? If it's marriage, then you don't know what to do when your husband is abusing you, right? You don't know that there is a law. At least in India, we have a law called the Domestic Law or Domestic Violence Act for women, and women are like, they don't know what their rights are, means they won't be able to enforce. They don't know that they have, like, very, very curated reliefs for under the law when they are undergoing domestic. For example, if they are afraid, women are afraid that if they complain against their husbands who are abusing them, they may, for example, be thrown out of the house. But the law also provides them for residence in their house. Their husbands have to give them residence, either in the same house or a rent allowance sort of a thing. When women, they cannot throw them out like that. So this is something many women don't know. So
Yeah.
these kinds of legal awareness training and filling the gap between this, where the state cannot, maybe due to lack of resources, come in and support women. That's where advocacy and activists, young activists, can play a very important role.
Yes, I totally agree. And thank you for ending on such an encouraging note. Your word will surely inspire the next generation to take action with the courage and, with the compassion. Radhula, thank you so much. On the behalf of SAREM, I want to express our deepest gratitude for your time and insight today. Your reflection remind us that the principle of non-violence and justice are not just ideal, but living commitment we must carry forward And to our listeners, thank you so much for tuning in. We hope this conversation sparks reflection and action in solidarity with the marginalized communities across the South Asia. Until next time, I am Zehra Naqvi, wishing you a peace, justice, and strength. Thank you so much for joining today.
Thank you for having me, Zehra. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you so much. Take care, and you look beautiful today.
Thank you. So do you.
Thank you so much.
Okay.
Take care.
Bye.